Why do people suffer? Is suffering good for us, or is pain a sign that something is wrong? And if suffering is bad, what can we do to reduce it, if not get rid of it altogether? There are certainly religious explanations for suffering. There is the concept of karma, that what you have done that is wrong will come back to you in the form of your own pain and suffering. There is the religious concept that suffering is a punishment for sins, a just universe that must explain all suffering by blaming those who suffer. And for some, human suffering is a test of one's faith. It may not be justified, but one may not complain, because then one fails the test. Buddhism claims that human suffering comes from attachments to the world, attachments to things, or even attachments to people. And the way to address suffering, to reduce suffering, is to reduce your attachments. Ultimately, the goal is to eliminate suffering entirely. And the way to do that is to stop the cycle of birth and death and rebirth, because this life is suffering in some level, on some level. And so the goal in Buddhism is to enter a paradise state they call nirvana. Jews and Christians and Muslims might call it heaven or Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, or Ha'olam Haba, the world to come. But they all have the same goal: no more suffering, at least in the next life, if we can't completely avoid suffering in this one. Judaism claims that the Hebrew people are the chosen people, an Am Segula, a people set, a nation set apart. And so we have to find explanations for Jewish suffering specifically. After all, if you are a special people, the chosen people set apart, why are you not always protected? Why do Jews suffer? Some rabbis claim that these are the chastisements of love. Remember that terrible line from the book of Proverbs, spare the rod and spoil the child? Well, we don't follow that these days, but in those days, they believed that sometimes if you were a chosen people, you were chosen for special attention. You were chosen for higher standards. You were chosen to be steel that would be tempered through heat and pressure and suffering. And if the Jewish people abandoned their God or did not follow his rules to the letter, then he might withdraw his protection for them to see the consequences of their choices, or he might even bring disaster upon them to punish them and to push them, to separate the wheat from the chaff and to put them back onto the right path. After all, according to the rabbis, there are 613 commandments, and so you're bound to mess up sometime. So another way to explain why bad things happen. Now, from a humanist perspective, suffering may have causes, but not necessarily cosmic reasons. It's the difference between how and why. How did this car accident happen? How did this child fall out of a tree? That we can explain, but why these happened on a cosmic level is simply not the right question. Anyone can certainly make a bad choice that causes pain for me or for those near me. That's a how. On any level, from one person to a whole society, they can cause human suffering by mistake or by indifference or from malice and hatred. That's a how. And sometimes suffering comes from the world doing what it does. Earthquakes and volcanoes do not target individuals. Sometimes we are just the ants being stepped on by the universe. And it's not even that the universe is indifferent to us, since indifferent implies some kind of possible attention. The universe simply is. Sometimes we get a sunny day, other days lightning strikes, and we suffer. We can learn to avoid it at times, or we can learn how to respond to this suffering, to alleviate suffering after it arrives, but suffering is a part of life, and that we agree with the Buddhists. The traditional Torah portion for this week is called Vayishlakh, and he shall send, from Genesis 32, verse 4 through 36, verse 43. And it explores the phenomenon of human suffering and ways to respond to it, and also who can cause the suffering. It may not have the same perspective we do. After all, the text was written by authors at least 2,500 years ago with a very different worldview from our own. But the story is responding to the same realities of family dynamics, group conflicts, and sometimes unexpected disasters. And even if the Torah text in its sparsity of mentioning emotions feels thin, we can still find the emotion reflected in the narrative. And so even if we don't agree with their answers, or we find few answers to comfort us, we can appreciate the situation described in our own parallel experience. And so let me set the setting for the beginning of chapter 32. Many years before this passage begins, Jacob and Esau were twin brothers, with Esau born just a few minutes before Jacob, and so Esau was the elder. Jacob did not like this arrangement, and so he cheated Esau, his elder, of two things that were promised for the firstborn. The first was something called a birthright, and the second was his father's special blessing for the firstborn to allow that son to rule over the others and the household. But Jacob disguised himself as Esau, deceived his father, and acquired the firstborn blessing as well as the birthright, which he extorted his brother for when his brother was starving. And so in our passage now, Jacob has left his home territory. He has gone far away to live with his uncle, and he has acquired two wives and their concubines and many children and great herds of flocks and servants and everything else. And as he's returning back to where he's from, he hears that Esau, his brother, is coming to meet him with 400 men. And so Jacob is not sure what Esau's intentions are, because after all, do you need 400 men to kiss and make up? Well, we'll find out. Jacob is very clever, like his mother Rebekah, who came up with the idea of tricking their father, and Jacob himself has used his tricksterdom many times in his experiences with his uncle. And we'll see how Jacob tries to manage the encounter with Esau that he knows is coming to protect himself. And we'll talk as well about what Esau's perspective is on the story. And so the story begins in 32 verse 4. Remember, by the way, that the verses and chapters are added later, and actually they're part of the Christian counting originally. This is not what you would find in a Torah scroll. You wouldn't find any verses or chapter numbers. You wouldn't even find a Torah name on it for the Torah portion, although the very first word of the portion is often the name of that portion. So this begins with Vayishlakh Yaakov, and Jacob sent. So Vayishlakh becomes the name of the Torah portion. But it begins with Jacob sending messengers ahead. He's heard his brother Esau is there, and so he sends messengers ahead to his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And we'll see a strong identification between Esau and Edom. It appears in when Esau's born, there's a connection made between the two. In fact, Esau is claimed to have red hair because Adom means red, and Edom sounds very similar to Adom, and there's a wordplay going on there. So Esau and Edom are connected to each other, and the Edomites are a major enemy of the Hebrews many centuries later, which may give us a clue into the context of this passage. In fact, often these narratives in Genesis come about as political explanations or describing political dynamics of a later period. They're also interesting stories, but it's also part of the dynamic of the writing that the politics is never that far behind. All right, so Jacob sends messengers ahead to Esau, and he instructs them as follows. Thus you will say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob. Notice the rhetoric there. He calls Esau Adon, my lord, and Avdecha, your servant. So he's already trying to, acquiesce or put himself in a subservient position as a kind of apology, or at least to assuage his brother's anger in advance by some flattery. That doesn't hurt either. I stayed with Laban and remained until now. I have acquired cattle and donkeys and sheep and male and female slaves, and I send this message to my lord, again, in the hope of gaining your favor. Limso chen be'enecha, to find favor in your eyes. So again, he's trying to appease him with the message. The messengers return to Jacob, and they say, we came to your brother Esau. He himself is coming to meet you, and there are 400 men with him. So now Jacob is very frightened. Again, why do you need 400 men to kiss and make up? He divided the people with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two camps, thinking, if Esau comes to one camp and attacks it, the other camp may yet escape. So you see here again, the trickster, the clever person, is thinking a step ahead and saying, if we can save even half, Perhaps it's worth it. Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your native land and I will deal bountifully with you. So he's talking to God and saying, God, just want to remind you that you told me if I went back home, things would be okay. I am unworthy of all the kindness you have so steadfastly shown your servant. With my staff alone, I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become 2 camps. So again, a little bit of flattery may help grease the wheels here. Save me, Hatzileni, deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. Or else, I fear, he may come and strike me down, mothers and children alike. You see the appeal here too? It's not just, you've done such wonderful things for me, flatter, flatter. You promised me things would turn out okay, hint, hint. Please save me because he'll kill me, and not just me. You know, if he kills me, whatever, I'm guilty. But the children and the mothers, you know, you hear the sort of pathos appeal here. Yet you have said, I will deal bountifully with you and make your offspring as the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. If you wipe out my family, how will this come true? You will have lied. I mean, Jacob is very clever here. You know, you may remember Odysseus at the very beginning of the Odyssey is described as the man of many turns or many tricks. And it's because he's so clever that he manages to survive, even outwitting the gods at times. And here, Jacob again is trying to be clever, I think, a little bit with Yahweh, the Hebrew God. After spending the night there in those 2 camps, he selected from what was at hand these presents for his brother Esau. 200 she-goats and 10 he-goats, 200 ewes and 10 rams. So again, he's giving him fertility here, lots of females and some males to be the studs, so to speak, for the females. 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 10 she-asses, 20 she-asses and 10 he-asses. These he put in charge of his servants, drove by drove, and he told the servants, go on ahead and keep a distance between droves. Now, why would he do that? Well, maybe it's to say, and yet there's more, and wait, there's more, you know, surprise with more and more and more coming. Or perhaps, again, it's the fear. What if he attacks the first group, assuming they're coming to assault him in some way? The others might be able to flee. So again, it's the divide and survive. This is not a military divide and conquer. This is a divide and live from Jacob's perspective. He instructed the one in front as follows. My brother Esau meets you and says, whose man are you? Where are you going? And whose animals are these ahead of you? You will answer, Avdecha Yaakov, again, your servant Jacob's. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and Jacob himself is right behind us. Well, it says, Gamhu acharenu, he is behind us in the Hebrew. The right behind us is a translation choice there. But he's coming. He's on his way. He's coming. He gave similar instructions to the second one and the third and the others who followed the droves. Thus and so you say to Esau when you reach him, and you will add, and your servant Jacob is right behind us. So again, that said, don't worry, he's coming. Don't worry, he's coming. Don't worry, he's coming. For he reasoned, he thought, if I atone with him, and the word in the Hebrew is interesting, propitiate, the fancy English word, but in Hebrew it says, ki amar achapera lefanav, achapra, and you can hear in the word kapar, like Kippur, it's the same root as Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So if I atone to him with this gift, it's not just that I'm, buttering him up. I'm actually trying to make up for what was done wrong. I'm atoning. So this is, again, one of those clues. If you have a suffering that's between people, sometimes you have to make up for what you did wrong. There is that idea of, atonement, not just to God, but atonement to people in order to get forgiveness or at least coexistence. So he says, if I atone him with presents in advance and then face him, then maybe I will see favor. Ulai, it says, perhaps he will lift up his face. He will lift up my face. So as I'm bowing down to him, instead of taking off my head, he will lift up my face and we can see each other. And so the gift went on ahead while Jacob remained in camp that night. That same night, he arose and taking his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 children, he crossed the ford of the Yabok, the river that's there. So he has a barrier between him and Esau as well. Remember, the camps are on one side. He sends all the animals to Esau, and then he retreats across the river, again, having a line of retreat. But after taking them across the stream, he sent across all his possessions as well, and Jacob was left alone. So now, again, here he is with a line of retreat, because they are on the other side of the river, the core animals and his family, and he is alone. In case Esau plows through everything else and finds him, he will alone be the one to face him. But Yevater Yaakov levado, and Jacob was left alone. V'ya'avek ish imo, a man wrestled with him, ad olot hashachar, until the break of the dawn, until the coming up of the dawn. What man is this, we might ask? When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched his hip at the thigh, or he wrenched his hip at the socket. In fact, it says literally, Vayiga b'chaf yirecho. He touched the palm of his thigh. So like the hamstring or the tendon on the inside of the thigh, and he wrenched this tendon in his thigh, and as Jacob was wrestling with him. And some readers actually speculate that he gave him a low blow. He didn't hit the thigh, but they didn't want to use that language, so that's what they meant by it. He took advantage of him, basically. And then this man, this strange figure, says, Shalcheni ki Allah hashachar. Let me go, because the dawn is coming up. The dawn is breaking. Vayomer, and he answered, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And remember, the other time Jacob was blessed was dealing with his father, right? He had to disguise himself, and he put things on his arms and had his mother make special food to fool his father. Well, here again, he's asking for a blessing. This is an interesting patriarch who's always looking for blessings from somebody else. Now, why does the man say dawn is breaking? He says dawn is breaking because if it is indeed a God, as we'll see, you can't see God's face. And if the dawn breaks, you might see it. And so the other one says, what is your name? And he replied, Yaakov, Jacob. And this being says, your name will no longer be Jacob. Lo Yaakov Ye'amer, you will no longer be called Jacob. Od Shimcha, your name will no longer be called. Ki im Yisrael ki sarita im Elohim ve'im anashim b'tuchal. Your name will now be Israel, because you have striven or wrestled, sarit, with beings divine and human. Literally it says im Elohim, with God or gods, ve'im anashim, and with people. V'tuchal, and you were able to, you succeeded. Wrestling with God. Well, later generations of philosophically minded Jews might have a cow at hearing this. What do you mean he wrestled with God? That's impossible. But in an earlier phase of Jewish mythology, evidently, you could wrestle with God and he might wrestle dirty. But you might still win. And Jacob is known for his strength. Remember when he first meets Rachel, he pushes a huge stone off a well that it takes several shepherds to move. So he has special skills and strength, and yet the God wins, but not by much. And so he gets a new name, Israel. And here again, you hear that nationalist narrative where Israel is the name, that is the name of the people that will rival Edom, the Edomites. So we get this origin story for this battle between the two. Again, we get this question of the source of suffering. He now, as you'll see, is going to limp from this experience. Even if he won, sometimes when you win, you lose. And sometimes when you wrestle with fate, fate throws you a wrench. Jacob asked, pray tell me your name. But he said, you must not ask my name. Interesting. So this is one of those passages where it seems to claim that you can't know the name of God. And Moses finds out the name of God in the beginning of the book of Exodus. Of course, there are other passages in the Hebrew Bible, even earlier than this one, where they use that name of God. So This is, again, one of those clues that there may be different sources that have been put together that have different attitudes on whether you can see a God, whether you can wrestle with a God, or whether you can even say the name of the God. And so he took leave of him there. And so Jacob named the place Peniel. I have seen the face of God, literally. Panim is face. Peniel is the face of God. I have seen a divine being face to face, panim el panim, and yet my life was preserved. The sun rose on him as he passed Penuel, slight different voweling there, limping on his hip. Okay, so here we again have the damaged here, that even if he wins, he faces suffering. Sorry, it keeps opening the commentaries, which I don't want. This is why the children of Israel today do not eat the thigh socket, the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, and do not eat the thigh muscle, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. So here we have this story about wrestling with a God and succeeding. And we also have an origin story for a dietary practice. In fact, if you eat kosher meat to this day, the thigh muscle, in a particular part of the thigh in cattle or in sheep, is not eaten. It's removed. It's a particular tendon that's taken out. And there's extensive rabbinic debates debating which one of these tendons it is that should be removed. But it's one of those legacies of this wrestling with God. And many people actually use that concept of God wrestling. There's a wonderful book by Arthur Waskow, who's a Jewish renewal rabbi, where he explores this concept of wrestling with God and wrestling with the concept of God and arguing with God. You know, they may not be fully secular, but they're certainly not fully pious in that God can do no wrong here. People can wrestle with God for sure. So I find this an interesting echo of sort of ancestry of our challenging of religious tradition. I know that people that face chronic illness sometimes feel like they're wrestling with a God and maybe losing at times. So that can be a particular challenge for them. And, you know, we feel for them. I guess the only hope we can provide is that it's not you. That is, you're not being punished. It's not like you have to add that guilt to whatever suffering you're dealing with. Sometimes this is the way life is. And it's not that you've chosen wrong. It's that you're grappling with the reality that was not arranged for your benefit. And so we have to find our way to come to terms with that instead. All right, let's move on to 33 then. And here we have the climax of the Jacob and Esau encounter. Looking up, Jacob saw Esau coming, accompanied by 400 men. He divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. Remember, each one of them has their own children. He put the maids and their children first, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Can you guess which ones he likes the most? We know that Rachel is the favored one. And we understand the maids are of a lesser category. And this also, by the way, has a political element to it as well, because the dominant tribes are generally the Leah and the Rachel tribes, and the less important tribes in later Israelite history are those who claim descent from the maids and their children. You know, Jacob winds up with 12 kids, and then later on, the nation of Israel has 12 tribes. What a coincidence! Well, except it's not a coincidence, because the stories are written to explain the tribes. So he divides up the tribes, put the maids first, Leah next, and Rachel and Joseph last. Benjamin hasn't even been born yet, as we'll see. Jacob himself went on ahead. Again, he's putting himself in front of his family. That's a commendable thing. He bowed low to the ground 7 times until he was near his brother. Esau ran to greet him. He embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. Now, there's a really fascinating detail in the orthography here, because over the word for he kissed him, there are a series of dots over each of the letters. You may see that if you look up at the Hebrew, there's one word that has a lot of dots over it. That's Vayishlakh, and he kissed him. Now, what does that mean? He kissed him, but also that there are those dots there. Well, a lot of rabbis have speculated that actually Esau was still mad at Jacob, and when he fell on his neck, he was going to bite it, almost like an animal, because Esau is seen as sort of this man of the field, aka beast. And yet, by God's mercy, it's turned into a kiss. You know, it's like your sword becomes a flower or something. So he's about to bite him, and And he winds up kissing him because God changes his heart. If he can harden Pharaoh's heart, he can soften Esau's heart. And then he blesses him. Actually, no, I'm sorry. He says, Vayivku, and they wept. Both of them are crying. Now, another speculation I read in an article actually just today is that when scribes put dots over letters sometimes, that means they think you shouldn't read it or it should be deleted in the next copying. They don't feel authorized themselves to delete it because it's the holy book that they're copying word for word, but maybe it's a mistake. It doesn't belong there. And so maybe at some point in the voweling or the pointing of the text or in the copying of the copying of the copying of the copying of the text, a scribe decided, you know what, this doesn't fit here. And so he took it out. We don't know. But on a surface reading of the text, it sounds like Esau is eager to reconcile. He runs to greet him. He embraces him and falls on his neck. And again, you could feel the drama here. We don't know what Esau's intention is. And Vayishlakh, and he kissed him, is what reveals the emotion. So he could have been running to grab him and to fall on his neck and attack him, but it's changed into a joyful reconciliation where they cry in each other's arms. So that's the plot twist, so to speak. Looking about, he saw the women and children. Who are these with you? He asks. And Jacob answers, the children with whom God has favored your servant. So I've been very fortunate that I've gotten all these children. And by the way, God's on my side. Maybe that's part of the hint there. God has favored me with these children, so you might want to take it easy on them. Maybe that's part of the subtext here. But if nothing else, he's introducing his family. The maids and the children come forward and bow low as well. And then Leah with her children. And finally, Joseph and Rachel come forward and bow low. And then Esau says, what do you mean by all this company which I've met, all those animals and all those servants that you sent me? And Jacob says, Limso chen be'enei Adoni, to find favor in my Lord's eyes. Notice he doesn't use the name Esau. He doesn't say brother. He's still calling him my Lord. Esau says, Yeshli rav achi, I have plenty, my brother. So Esau's the one who brings up my brother. Let what you have stay with yours. I've got plenty. I don't need any. And Jacob says, Alna imna matzati chen be'enecha. And the nas in the Hebrew is sort of obsequious language. Please, please, or oh my Lord, please. Sort of extra flattery. So the alna imna is like, oh, he's extra obsequious at this moment, extra sort of groveling. No, I pray you, do me this favor. If I found favor in your eyes, take this gift from my hand. Ki al ken ra'iti panecha kirot panei Elohim. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God. And receive me favorably. You've received me favorably. Now, this adds a twist to the previous chapter. We talked about wrestling with his father and deceiving him, asking for a blessing. We talked about wrestling with God. But maybe the person he's wrestling with, in his mind at least, in his dream overnight, is his brother. Because seeing your face, that's what the God looked like last night. Now I get it. You see? So when he named that place Peniel, he thought it was God, but actually it was the image of his brother. That, again, it's another possible reading to this text, to read it that way. And the successful resolution has him feeling elevated, almost as if his brother is a god, or that encounter was as meaningful to him as this one. Please accept my present, which has been brought to you, for God has favored me, and I have plenty. And when he urged him, he accepted. And, this is a little bit like that old story about Arabic or Bedouin hospitality, where you offer something, they refuse, you offer something, they refuse, you offer a third time, then they grudgingly accept, okay? So this is that dynamic of you offer and they refuse, and eventually it's accepted. This is sort of pastoral culture here. And then Esau says, let's go on our journey, and I will proceed next to you. Kenegdecha, which could mean next to you or, parallel to you. But neged also has the sense of against you. So there's, again, if you're thinking suspiciously, and Esau says, let's get moving and I'll go against you. What? You might be a little bit nervous. Okay. And again, we get to read this in a positive way or in a threatening way. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows. Notice he still hasn't said my brother. He's still saying my Lord. He's still nervous. My brother, you know that the children are frail, and the flocks and herds which are nursing, they are a care to me. I have to be careful with them. If they are driven hard a single day, all the flocks will die. Notice he's got shepherds, he's got animals with baby animals, he's got his own children, he's got his wives. Esau's got 400 fighting men. They're going to go a lot faster at their natural pace, even though Esau offered perhaps to go parallel to keep his pace to Jacob's pace. Let my Lord go on ahead of his servant while I travel slowly at the pace of my cattle and the children until I meet my Lord in Seir. We'll wind up there. There's also a pun, by the way, on the name of the place they're going to, Seir, because it's from the same root as hair, like body hair. And Esau is described as the hairy man when he's born. He comes out with red hair on him. And he's sort of the man of the fields, the hunter, the testosterone, hairy man of Iron John fame. And so they're going to a place called Hairy Town or something. And so that's, again, it's Esau's home territory, right? It's where he belongs. And then Esau said, let me assign to you some of the men who are with me. I'll give you an honor guard, aka a security force, which could be in your favor or, again, could be a threat. And Jacob said, oh, no, my Lord is too kind. You do me too much favor. No need for that. And so Esau started back that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed on to Sukkot, a different city, a different territory, and built a house for himself and made Sukkot, made these temporary stalls for his cattle. And that is why the place was called Sukkot. So it's giving an origin for this place called Sukkot, but it's also pointing out that Jacob says, don't worry, I'm right behind you, and goes a different direction to a different place. Jacob arrived safe in the city of Shechem in the land of Canaan, having come from Padan Aram all the way in the east, and he encamped before the city. The parcel of land where he pitched his tent, he bought from the children of Hamor for 100 ketas, and he set up an altar there and called it El Elohei Yisrael, God, the God of his new name, right? Israel. Well, what's your verdict on Esau? Was he a threat? Was Jacob overly cautious, or was he genuine and Jacob simply outsmarted him one more time and escaped when it wasn't needed, that Esau was genuinely trying to reconcile? Yeah. Well, and this is why, again, the attitude you come to the text with makes a big difference. So there's a famous line attributed to Rashi, who's a medieval commentator on the Torah and Jewish tradition, which is a simple line, Esav soneh et Yaakov. Esau hates Jacob. And Esau becomes the stand-in for the non-Jewish world. Jacob is the smooth man who lives in the tent, and Esau is the rough man who's in the field and hunting, and Esau is thought to be crude, and Jacob is thought to be sophisticated. Again, this is like projecting values out there. But the sense is that Esau is the non-Jewish world, the stand-in for Edom, which is a stand-in for the Romans or Christendom. And if Esau hates Jacob, then this story is going to be read through that lens of suspicion. And that's how you're going to read it. It's the conceptual framework in which it appears. Yes, Brown has a comment.
I'm wondering if maybe the origin, the idea that maybe if Jacob hadn't been so suspicious of Esau, maybe things wouldn't be so bad with the Edomites now.
Okay. So yes, maybe it's an origin story, but in Jacob is flawed version, that it's Jacob's fault. If he had been more open, if he had said my brother early on, then maybe that would have helped repair the relationship, and again, this is a lesson for us. Some of our suffering is caused by misunderstandings, or by things that some people have let go and you keep carrying with you. You might be still upset about something that happened between you and someone else, and they forgot about it a long time ago, or they let it go, but you're still carrying that grudge, and you imagine they are too. After all, why does Jacob come with 400 men? I'm sorry, why does Esau come with 400 men? Maybe he thinks that Jacob is coming with a large party to get him. It's he's arming himself in advance. Cindy has a hand up.
I actually found this a bit different from how I'd heard it in Sunday school, and that
I hope so.
Yeah, coming from a different tradition. There was just this expectation that Jacob was like almost unquestionable. Like, of course he was right, and of course Esau, was the aggressor. Of course, like Esau had it coming. It not so much because Esau did anything, but because God wanted it that way. And it's one of those things that never really sat well or made sense to me. Like, why, if God sets up these rules for who gets the birthright and who gets the blessing and whatever, why would God then kind of, invert it, other than to then, continue the mental gymnastics of Christianity down the road as far as my childhood was concerned.
Or by the way, traditional Orthodox Judaism also is much more willing to cast the blame on Esau than on Jacob.
Yeah, I actually find myself far more sympathetic to Esau than I probably had been before. Not that I've given it a lot of thought lately.
Right. Well, this is that challenge of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. If you are going to try to, repair a relationship, sometimes it helps to be able to see it from their side and to imagine what they're feeling. So, Jacob is worried about his brother's response, and his brother may have been worried about Jacob's response. And, they land together, and that suspicion is just too much to overcome in the end, even if they try to atone with the gifts and the kindness and my brother. In the end, the gulf is just too big, and they can't seem to get past that history. But we'll see, maybe they will at the end. Also, I'll point out, just as a historical side note, that Jacob sets up an altar not in Jerusalem, it's somewhere else. And so this again reflects a source that suggests that there isn't only one place to see God or to encounter God or to worship God. He met God at Peniel. He sees God at Bethel elsewhere, which is where he sees the angels go up and down the ladder in Jacob's ladder story in Genesis 28. And here again, he makes an altar to worship God. And he says, El Elohe Yisrael, the God of Israel is the name of that altar. And again, this is an origin story for what probably was an altar that people knew before a later generation wiped out all the altars and made everybody go to Jerusalem. Yeah, Brown has another thought.
Just this story and many of these Jacob and Abraham and Isaac stories probably transmitted orally for a very long time. So it's possible we have plot elements that have been received orally, but the part that makes it make sense got left out in the oral transmission.
Yes and no. I mean, I'm thinking as a parallel example, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are also thought to show hallmarks of that kind of oral transmission. And they'll often talk about emotional, inner life and monologue and feelings and so on. Penelope lamenting Odysseus being gone for so many years. And that's an oral tradition in theory. I think this is a different style of oral tradition. And there are parts where things are repeated. Notice what he says to the servants. He repeats, and he repeats it again a couple of times. And where the children are laid out, that repetition is often thought to be a sign of oral transmission. But they didn't choose to include some things in this style of storytelling. But it may also be true that when you're writing on animal skin in an alphabet that's designed without vowels to save space, then maybe you do cut down the story to its bare bones and you don't put in the extra descriptions and embellishment, in part to make it interesting, but also in part because of economy of space. It'd be even harder carving it into stone, but writing on animal skins, as early Torah scrolls were done, had certainly its limitations too. Okay, I'm going to go on to chapter 34. We're not going to do all the way through 36 because 36 is mostly genealogy, but 34 and 35 are definitely worth looking at. Now, 34 is the story of Dinah. Dinah, the daughter whom Leah had born to Jacob, whom we never heard about before now. Right? I think they mentioned her very briefly, and she also had a daughter, Dinah, just to set up this story. But now we finally get to learn something, or maybe, about Dinah and what happens to her. The daughter whom Leah had born to Jacob went out to visit the daughters of the land. She went to go chat with her neighbors, right? Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the chief of the country, that's the person who owns the land, he saw her and he took her and lay with her with force. Vayishkav ota v'ya'aneha. Now, ya'aneha is tricky because it literally means he afflicted her. It's not the modern word for rape, but it could also mean he lowered her. Sometimes it's translated as he humbled her. So it's not entirely clear whether this is consensual or not. Now, the fact that he yikach ota, he took her, maybe that's the problem, although that's the word used for to take a wife, you lakach a wife, and he lay with her. And now, does it say that he forced her? Maybe. Does it say that he debased her in some way? Some rabbis actually speculate that he did some kind of, quote, unnatural sex acts with her, and that was what happened here. But it could also be that it was, if not consensual, at least not out of the ordinary, but the fact that he was from the outside, the fact that he was from the Canaanites and not from the clan of the Hebrews, that was debasing to her just to be with him. Just by being together, he debased her, he polluted her, he defiled her. And we have that language sometimes, certainly in more racially charged eras. So again, we can't know exactly what it's saying here. In general, the rabbis understood it to be raped, took and forcibly took her. If you read Anita Diamant's The Red Tent, which is a midrashic sort of creative re-envisioning of this story, there it's a great love story. I mean, she even goes on rhapsodic about the bare, hairless chest of Shechem, which I find absurd in the Middle East. Like, good luck finding a hairless chest anywhere among men in the Middle East, okay? But it's got to look like Fabio to some extent in that part of the story. But she sees it as a love story, that Dinah fell in love right away, and that he swept her up and took her to the town with him, and they were living happily, at least initially, according to Diamant's retelling of the story. So again, we have to sort of play with both meanings here as we go along. Vatidvak nafsho badina, and his soul was glued literally to Dinah. He was attached, he became attached to her, strongly drawn, it says here. And he was in love with the maiden. Vaye'ehav, he fell in love. And again, they use love very, very rarely. But here they say that Shechem fell in love with Dinah. And he spoke to her heart, Alev Hana'ara, to the heart of the maiden he spoke. So here it says tenderly, but heartfelt, or he appealed to her, or again, maybe they did make some kind of a connection. So Shechem said to his father Hamor, Kach li et hayalda hazot leisha, get me this girl as a wife. I mean, you get the sense that she's young, by the way, because he uses the word yalda, which is like a girl, like a kid girl, not a woman. So that also raises some hackles for us. Now, Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter Dinah. And the word they use in Hebrew is tima. He had made her, defiled. He had made her profane. He had profaned her. He had made her, spiritually schmutzy. It's not the technical term, but you get the idea. But since his sons were in the field with his cattle, Jacob kept silent until they came home. If he raised a stink and he didn't have his sons to protect him, what might have happened? But again, the sense here is that Dinah has something wrong happened here. Whether it was rape or the pollution of the bloodline, it was still wrong from Jacob's perspective. Then Shechem's father Hamor came out to Jacob to speak to him. And Jacob's sons, having heard the news, came in from the field. The men were distressed and very angry. He committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing not to be done. Again, it says lishkav et bat Yaakov, to lie with his daughter. But again, to lie with her could be consensual, could be not. Is it a pollution or is it a rape? Again, it could go both ways. Hamor says, my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us. V'hitchatnu otanu, marry with us. Benotechem, give us your daughters. V'titnu lanu et benotenu, and we'll give you our daughters to take for yourself. Let's mix. You will live with us, and the land will be open before you settle, move about, acquire holdings in it. And then Shechem, this is the rapist here, said to her father and brothers, do me this favor, and I will pay whatever you tell me as the bride price. Ask me a bride price, ever so high, however high you want it. It says, Harbu alai ma'od mohar, multiply upon me the bride price. And the gifts required too, and I will give it. I will pay what you tell me. Just give me the maiden for a wife. Now, in traditional society, sometimes that is the solution to rape, is the rapist is forced to marry the woman he raped because it's not written from her perspective or what she might want. The goal is to make whole the violation. And the virginity, of course, belonged to the household, to the father, not to the woman herself. And so to make it good, you're expected to marry the rapist, and he's trying to make good under the terms of life then. Now, Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor, speaking with guile, because he had defiled their sister Dinah. So we already see a hint from the author. The narrator is telling us they're tricking him. We already know it. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to a man with a foreskin. That's what it literally says. Latet et achotenu, to give our sister, leish asher lo orla, to a man who has a foreskin. That is a disgrace among us. It's yucko. It's well, treif is a later term, of course, but it's just not what we do. This is what we do. We circumcise. Our sister has to go to a man who's circumcised and said, this is the only way we'll agree with you. If you agree to be circumcised, all your males, then we'll give our daughters to you and take your daughters to ourselves, and we'll live with you as one people. So convert basically to our ritual practice, or at least our, cosmetic surgery practice. And then we can become one people. But if you don't listen to us and become circumcised, we'll take our sister and then we'll leave with all our flocks and everything. Their words pleased Hamor and Hamor's son Shechem. They said, okay. The youth lost no time in doing the thing, for he wanted Jacob's daughter. He's clearly attached to her. And he was the most respected in his father's house. So when they went to the public place and spoke to their townsmen, they were convincing. These people are our friends. It says literally, Anashim ha'elu shleimim hem. They are whole. They are peaceful. They're stand-up people, right? Let's let them settle in the land and move about. The land is large enough for them. We'll take their daughters as our wives and give our daughters to them, but only on the condition will they allow us to do this, that all our males become circumcised as they are. Their cattle and their substance and all their beasts will be ours if we agree to their terms. So they will settle among us. So here's a line that, again, raises a little bit of suspicion. Are they really being genuine and opening their doors and saying, yes, let's be one people? Or is there a greed there? There's a famous story where a king converted to Catholicism because he said, Paris is worth a mass. So our Shechem and Hamor here saying, all their cattle, all their property being part of our nation is worth our foreskins. I don't know. And I don't know that I would have made that deal, frankly, if I had been them. All who went out of the gate of the town listened to Hamor and his son, all the males, were circumcised. On the third day, when they were still in pain, Simeon and Levi, Shimon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, the brothers of Dinah, remember she's from Leah and so are they, each took his sword, came upon the city unbothered, and killed all the males who were unable to fight back. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword. They took Dinah out of his house, as they had threatened before, and they went away. The other sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the town because their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and asses, all that was inside the town and outside, all their wealth, all their children and their wives, all that was in the houses they took of captives and booty. So they wound up getting the daughters of Shechem and Hamor, just not a two-way street. I'll also point out, by the way, that this indicates that Jewishness, or Hebrewness at this phase is more accurate, was not necessarily purely matrilineal, because notice they can take all these wives from this other people, who knows if they converted them, right? And yet integrate them into their community. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You've brought trouble on me, made me odious among the inhabitants of the lands, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My men are few in number. Look what you did. If other people hear about this, they're going to attack us." And their response, to which Jacob has no answer, "Hakazona ya'aseh et achotenu? Should our sister be treated like a whore?" Zonah is whore. So here we have again suffering, right? The suffering of the Canaanites, and do we have sympathy for them, or are they wicked enough people that we don't? I mean, we certainly probably don't have sympathy for Hamor, the rapist. But his father, who was trying to make good, the other men who were deceived into doing this, again, maybe they were interested in material gain, but is this the proper compensation? Jacob's afraid of creating more conflict. But they also answered, our sister deserves some kind of justice. Sometimes there are no good guys. The patriarch has his problems, his son have their problems, the Canaanites have their problems. And what does Dinah think? We don't know. Because Dinah doesn't show up again, and she doesn't even speak in this. The most we hear of her is going out to see the daughters of the land. We don't know her perspective at all. And that's the space into which Anita Diamant steps when she writes The Red Tent from Dinah's perspective. Well, as time is running short, or the service is running long either way, I just want to give a quick review of what appears in chapter 35, because again, there's really fascinating details here. God says to Jacob, "Go up to Bethel and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing." This was in chapter 28, when Jacob was leaving his homeland. On his way out, he goes to a place in the north of what is now Israel called Bethel, and he saw the angels going up and down the ladder, and he called it Bethel at that time, and so that's why it has the name Bethel. So Jacob says to his household and all with him, "Get rid of those alien gods." They'd had alien gods this whole time? Evidently. Again, this is a later generation trying to purify the cult that's saying get rid of all those other gods, aside from Yahweh. But it's put into the mouth of Jacob. Purify yourselves, change your clothes. Let's go up to Bethel. I'll build an altar there to the God who answered me when I was in distress. They gave him all the alien gods, and he buried them under the terebinth near Shechem. And as they set out, a terror from God fell upon the city. So this is the chosen people with a protection bubble around them as they move along, and no one attacks them. They go to Luz, that is Bethel in the land of Canaan, all the people with them. He built an altar there and named the site El Bethel, the God of Bethel, because this is where God had revealed himself. And at that space, we have this fascinating detail. Deborah, the nurse of Rebekah. So this is like an aunt or an adoptive mother, maybe, of Jacob, because Rebekah was his mother. She died and was buried under the oak, and so it was called Alon Bachut. It is the oak of crying, of weeping. So again, a side note about this woman dying and they bury her, we don't get her story either, because it's the men's narrative that's recorded. And God appeared again to him and said, "You whose name is Jacob, you will be called Jacob no more, but Israel shall be your name." And so he named him Israel. Wait a minute. Didn't that already happen? It did in a different source, but this version is slightly different. And God said to him, "I am El Shaddai. Be fertile and increase. A nation, an assembly of nations will descend from you. Kings will issue from your loin." And there's a play in the Hebrew that they never put in the translation. So El Shaddai is often translated as the God Almighty, but Shaddai is the same root as Shadayim, which means breasts. I am the God of breasts, be fertile and increase. See a relationship there? Yes. But nobody draws on that, and they make their translations. They're missing a potential play there. So here again, you have a name change it's a new covenant. It's a promise of many descendants to come. The land that I assigned to Abraham and Isaac, I give to you and to your offspring. And so we have a third covenant now, not just with Abraham, not just with Isaac, but also with Jacob / Israel, as he's known now. Although it's interesting, it says, call your name Israel, and then just a few verses later, and Jacob set up a pillar. Well, wait a minute. Shouldn't his name be Israel? Again, we have these seams in the writing, or maybe the narrator continues to call him Jacob, but in public, he's known as Israel. And so he sets up a site, and he gave the site the name of Bethel, which he did before, and he's doing again. They set out from Bethel. When they were some distance short, Rachel was in childbirth, and she had hard labor. Just like Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother had a hard labor with the two children wrestling within her. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, oh, midwife? Again, wouldn't we love more detail, but we don't get it. And in fact, the word for the midwife is the miyaledet, the birther, the person who helps the birthing process. And birthing is even from the root of yeled, child, the childinator. Said, do not fear, it is another boy for you. You have a ben, you have a son. But as she breathed her last, vayahi batset nafsha, as her soul departed, that idea that your soul is the last breath, as you die, is the soul leaving. As her soul departed because she was dying, she called his name, it's a ben, a son, she called it Ben Oni, son of my affliction. That's her last dying breath, is to name her child, son of my affliction. But her father changes the name. In most cases, the mothers get to name the kids. But here Jacob changes it. He doesn't want to name a kid son of my affliction. So he instead makes it son of my right hand, Binyamin, or Benjamin. Tamot Rachel, and Rachel died. She was buried on the road to Ephrat, now Bethlehem. Over her grave, Jacob set up a pillar. It is the pillar at Rachel's grave, Ad Hayom, until this day. There is actually a place called Kever Rachel, the grave of Rachel. Whether it's the real Rachel or a place they claim to be Rachel, well, that depends on your perspective. But now the narrator changes. Just in the line before, in verse 20, it was Yaakov that set up the pillar, but here it is, Vayisa Yisrael, and Israel journeyed on even further. Reuben went and lay with his father's concubine, and Israel found out, what's going on in this family? And now we get the genealogy of the full 12 tribes. But at the end of this story, here's where we get the possibility of reconciliation. Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, where Isaac and Abraham had sojourned. Isaac was 180 years old when he breathed his last, and he died. He was gathered to his kin in ripe old age, and he was buried by both of his sons, Esau and Yaakov Banav. Now, we don't know, is that the beginning of a reconciliation? Is that the end of their relationship? The last thing they do is to bury their father together? We don't know. But it leaves us a hint that maybe there was more of a reconciliation than we saw in the previous chapter, or maybe it's sometimes over death that brothers can reconcile. Sometimes families are split apart by funerals, and I've seen it. It's been terrible. And other times they find a way to come together for what's needed to be done, and that helps them reconnect in a new and meaningful way. After all, it's a family tradition now in this family, because this is also what happened to Abraham. When Abraham died, his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, come together to bury him. So maybe there is hope that through the sufferings of life, through the sufferings we inflict on each other, through the conflict and the pain that we cause, there are ways to get past it. And sometimes it takes other pain to distract us. When you have a toothache and you slam your finger in the door to fix the toothache, sometimes it's how our emotions work too. We have new pain that reminds us that the old pain is old, and maybe it's time to move forward. So I'd like to ask if there are any last comments or questions or thoughts on this passage before we have our closing song and wish each other Shabbat Shalom and good night. Any last thoughts on human suffering in this Torah passage? I mean, you can see how reading the Torah can be a traumatic experience, if only vicariously from what's happening to the characters. But if you were a rape victim, if you were part of a broken family, if you were part of a family with sibling rivalry or major conflict between siblings, this could be a trigger story for you because you see it reflected in this ancient history. But I would hope that seeing it here also provides some measure of comfort to know that this is the way of the world and there are ways to get past it and to find healing and reconnection.